kind cowboy saved a young Apache mother and her 3 children in a deadly snowstorm. Jack Harmon adjusted his worn leather gloves, gripping the reins tightly as his horse fought against the fierce wind. The storm had come out of nowhere, just like all the others on this desolate planet. Snowflakes, thick as wool, swirled around him, blinding him for moments at a time. He squinted against the storm, his breath visible in the frigid air as he urged his horse forward. It wasn't just the wind or the snow that made the planet treacherous. It was the dangers that hid in the storm's chaos, the unseen predators, the rough terrain, and the quiet wilderness that seemed to swallow anything that dared cross its path. Jack had seen his share of storms. He'd been a cowboy all his life, ranching, riding, and surviving alone. But this was different. The snowstorm was relentless, blocking out the sun and leaving the world in a thick white haze. The roads were barely visible, and his usual route was lost in the storm's fury. He had been on a routine trip delivering supplies to a nearby settlement when the weather turned for the worse. Now, with no clear path ahead, Jack had no choice but to follow his instincts. They had always served him well. The wind howled louder, rattling his bones, but Jack pushed forward. He had his orders: get the supplies delivered, no matter the cost. But as he pressed on, something caught his attention, just beyond the swirling snow. A faint shape, something out of place in the middle of nowhere. Jack slowed his horse, his sharp eyes scanning the area. It wasn't far from where he stood that Jack spotted the small cabin, its outline barely visible through the thick snow. It was strange to see a building this far from any settlement. No one usually traveled this deep into the wild. His instincts told him to keep going, but something about that cabin felt different, as though it was calling him. Something told him he wasn't the only one braving the storm. Jack approached cautiously, his horse's hooves crunching in the snow. He saw the smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that someone was inside. His fingers tightened around the reins, and with a firm decision he dismounted and walked toward the cabin. The wind whipped around him, but Jack knew better than to ignore a potential sign of life in such a storm. Knocking at the door, Jack waited. For a moment there was silence, and then he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The door opened just a crack, revealing a pair of cautious eyes behind the worn wooden frame. "You lost?" a soft voice asked, barely audible above the wind. Jack nodded, his voice steady but filled with concern. "The storm's got me off course. Thought I'd find shelter here." The woman who stood in the doorway was young, her face weathered but strong. Her dark eyes locked onto his, sizing him up. Behind her, Jack could see a small fire crackling in the hearth. It was warm inside, a stark contrast to the freezing winds outside. "I'm Sonny," the woman said after a brief pause. "This is my home. You're welcome to stay, but we've got little to offer." Jack felt a shift in the air, a sense of warmth that didn't just come from the fire. It was the unspoken kindness in her eyes. He was no stranger to hospitality, but there was something genuine in her voice, a quiet strength that made him trust her immediately. "I'll be grateful for anything," Jack said, stepping inside the cabin. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, and he exhaled, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. The cabin was small but cozy, with a few sparse pieces of furniture, a table, some chairs, and a small bed in the corner. But what caught his attention immediately were the 3 children huddled near the fire. They were all young, no older than 6 or 7, their faces tired and pale. The oldest girl, who looked about 7, stared at Jack with wide eyes, her gaze curious but cautious. Sonny noticed his glance and smiled softly. "These are my children," she said, stepping aside so he could see them more clearly. "This is Kiona, my oldest. The others are Talon and Juno." Jack nodded, his gaze softening. "You all look like you've been through a lot." Sonny's expression darkened for a moment, but then she composed herself, her voice steady as she spoke. "We've been out here for a while, trying to stay away from the chaos. The storm came in faster than we expected." Jack could see the strain in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about the snowstorm. There was something deeper, a sense of worry that lingered in the air. He understood. There were stories about the growing tensions between settlers and the native Apache people. People were getting desperate, fighting over land, resources, and survival. Jack had heard the whispers, but he had no interest in getting involved. He had his own battles to fight. Sonny motioned for Jack to sit by the fire. He gratefully accepted, warming his hands by the heat. As he settled in, he noticed the look of weariness in Sonny's eyes. She was strong, no doubt about it, but Jack could tell she was fighting a battle of her own. He respected that. "You're a healer, aren't you?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. It was a simple question, but He'd noticed the way she'd moved around the cabin, efficient, confident, like someone used to taking care of others. Sonny nodded. I try to be. I've learned from my people. But these storms, they take more than I can give. Jack sat quietly, considering her words. He could sense the weight of responsibility she carried, not just for her children, but for herself as well. There was no telling what she had been through, but Jack knew that life out here was hard, even for the strongest, and yet there was something about her spirit that made Jack want to help. He couldn't explain it. It was just the right thing to do. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the cabin's walls, but Jack wasn't afraid of the storm anymore. Here, in this small cabin, surrounded by these people, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He knew the storm would pass, but the memory of this night would stay with him long after. For now, though, all he could do was offer what little he had, his skills, his strength, and his word, that he would help them get through this night. Jack didn't know how long the storm would last, but he knew one thing for certain. No one was going to face it alone. The snowstorm raged outside, battering the walls of the small cabin with relentless force. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a comforting contrast to the fierce winds, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension that filled the room. Jack Harmon sat by the fire, his face tired but alert, watching as Sonny tended to her children. Kiona, the oldest of the three, sat beside her mother, her eyes fixed on the fire, as she fidgeted with a small weathered doll in her hands. Talon and Juno, the younger children, were nestled together on the bed in the corner, their faces pale but peaceful in sleep. Sonny moved quietly around the cabin, checking the fire, making sure the children were warm enough, and tending to the little things that seemed to matter most. Her every movement spoke of quiet strength, the kind of strength that Jack had always respected. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt a pang of guilt. He was used to being alone, riding through life without much thought for others. But this family, stuck out in the middle of nowhere in the harshest of storms, had touched something deep inside him. He had always considered himself a man of the land, someone who survived by his wits, his skills, and his gun. But here, with Sonny and her children, he felt something different. He wasn't just a cowboy, he was a protector, someone who could make a difference, even if just for one night. Sonny turned to Jack, her voice soft as she spoke. Thank you for coming here. I wasn't sure what to expect from a stranger. Jack looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze. I don't consider myself much of a stranger, he said, his voice steady but warm. I'm just a man trying to do what's right. Sonny smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Jack couldn't ignore. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she looked after her children. It was the look of someone carrying a heavy burden. Jack had seen it before, on the faces of the settlers who came to this planet fighting for land and resources. But there was something different about Sonny. She wasn't fighting for land, she was fighting for her family, for their survival in a world that seemed intent on destroying everything she held dear. You've got a lot of weight on your shoulders, Jack said, his voice low. But you're strong. I can see that. Sonny's eyes softened at his words, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she glanced toward the children, her gaze lingering on them as though she were taking comfort in their quiet presence. Jack could feel the heaviness in the air, the unspoken truths that hung between them. He didn't push her to speak, knowing that when she was ready, she would. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, resting his head against the back of the chair. He wasn't used to being around people, especially not in such close quarters. But there was something about this family that made him feel like he had a purpose again. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about protecting something bigger, something worth fighting for. You know, Jack said, breaking the silence, I've never been much of a family man. Sandy looked at him, her expression curious but understanding. Why's that? Jack shifted in his seat, his eyes falling to the floor. I've always been a loner. Out here, it's easier that way. No attachments, no one to worry about. But seeing you all like this, in this storm, it makes me think about what I've been missing. Sandy nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. It's easy to shut yourself off from others, to think you're better off alone. But sometimes, the best parts of life come from the people we care about. Her voice softened, almost wistful. Family is everything. Without it, we have nothing. Jack felt the weight of her words. There was a truth in them that hit him harder than he expected. He had always believed in being self-reliant, depending only on himself. But here, in this cabin with Sonny and her children, he realized that he had been missing something important all along. It wasn't about surviving on his own. It was about sharing the burden with others, about being there when someone needed you most. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, Jack and Sandy shared a quiet understanding, a connection that didn't need words. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by the same storm, the same struggle to survive. As the night stretched on, Sonny moved toward the fire, gathering the children into her arms one by one. Kiana, though older than her siblings, clung to her mother, her small hand resting gently on Sonny's shoulder. Jack watched them with a quiet smile, seeing the love and warmth between them. He could see it in the way they held each other, in the way Sonny protected them with every breath she took. It was a bond stronger than any storm, stronger than any challenge they might face. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind wandering to thoughts of the future. The storm would pass eventually, and when it did, what would happen? Would he go back to his lonely life, riding the endless plains alone, or would he choose a different path? He wasn't sure yet. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a choice. The wind howled again, but it was quieter now, more distant. Jack stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long ride. He glanced over at Sonny, who was carefully tucking the children into bed. "You need help with anything?" Jack asked, his voice low but sincere. Sonny looked up, her face softening at his offer. "You've already done enough, but thank you." Jack nodded, his heart warming at the kindness in her voice. He didn't need anything more than that. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something worth fighting for. A family. As the night deepened, Jack settled into his place by the fire, the warmth of the room slowly lulling him to sleep. Tomorrow, they would face whatever the storm threw at them. But tonight, they were safe. And that, Jack thought, was enough. The wind had calmed slightly by morning, but the snowstorm was far from over. The world outside was still a frozen wasteland, with thick snow blanketing everything in sight. The sun barely made its way through the overcast sky, offering little warmth, but Jack could tell the storm was shifting. He could feel it in the air, in the way the wind had changed direction. Inside the cabin, Jack stirred from his sleep. The fire had dimmed overnight, and the warmth of the room had begun to fade. Sonny had already risen, tending to the children and making breakfast. The small cabin smelled of warm bread and coffee, a sharp contrast to the freezing cold outside. The children were still asleep, curled up close to their mother for warmth. Jack stretched, rubbing his eyes, and stood up. His body was sore from the ride and the cold, but he could tell he had to act quickly. He couldn't afford to wait for the storm to pass on its own. They needed to prepare. The cabin was running out of supplies, and they couldn't stay here forever. Sonny noticed Jack moving around and gave him a small nod. "We'll need to go out soon," she said quietly. "I've got a few supplies, but it won't last long." Jack nodded, looking out the window. He knew she was right. The storm was relentless, but they couldn't survive off of nothing. They would need food, firewood, and whatever else they could find to last until the storm ended. There was no guarantee the weather would improve soon, but staying put wasn't an option. "We'll need to be careful," Jack said, his voice steady. "The predators in this area won't hesitate to take advantage of the situation." Sandy's face tightened at the mention of the dangerous creatures that roamed the wilderness. Jack had heard stories about the mutated wildlife, ferocious, aggressive creatures that had adapted to the harsh conditions of the planet. He knew that Sonny, being a skilled hunter, was aware of the dangers, but even she couldn't take them lightly. The creatures were quick, and they hunted in packs. If they were unlucky enough to encounter one, survival would be a struggle. "I'll be ready," Sonny replied, determination in her eyes. She had faced challenges before, but she knew this one was different. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting to protect her children, and Jack. She didn't want to admit it, but she was beginning to rely on him. There was a quiet strength in him, something she hadn't seen in many people. Jack turned to the children, who had started to wake up. Kiana was the first to sit up, rubbing her eyes. She looked at Jack with a mixture of curiosity and cautious trust. Talon and Juno were still asleep, exhausted from the long night. Jack smiled at them, trying to put them at ease. "Don't worry, little ones," Jack said, his voice soft. "We're going to find what we need and get back here as soon as we can." Kiana nodded, though her eyes were still wide with uncertainty. She had seen her mother fight for their survival, but she had never seen anything like the storm that surrounded them now. It was hard for her to imagine that they would make it through, but there was something about Jack's calm presence that made her feel just a little bit safer. Sonny handed Jack his coat, her hands lingering for a moment as she looked him over. She had come to rely on him in the past few days more than she had expected. He was quiet, but his actions spoke louder than words. He had been there when they needed him, and now, as the storm continued to batter their world, Sonny realized that she trusted him. Jack pulled on his coat and grabbed his rifle, checking it for the umpteenth time. He didn't want to admit it, but he was nervous. He had faced many dangers in his life, bandits, storms, wild animals, but he had never been so far from civilization, so deep in the wilderness with so much on the line. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting a mother and her children, and that weighed on him more than he cared to acknowledge. "You ready?" Sandy asked, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. Jack nodded. "Let's get moving." They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their skin. The snowstorm had eased a little, but the wind still howled, pushing snow across their path. Jack led the way, keeping a sharp eye out for any signs of danger. Sandy stayed close behind, her movements careful but determined. The children stayed behind the cabin, where they would be safe for now. They moved slowly, cautiously, taking every step with purpose. Jack had learned to read the land in ways that most people never did. The slight shift in the wind, the tracks left in the snow, the subtle sounds of the wilderness. He paid attention to everything, always alert. Sonny, too, was quiet as she moved. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. After a while, they came across a cluster of trees, their branches weighed down with heavy snow. Jack stopped, raising a hand to signal Sonny to halt. He knelt down, inspecting the snow beneath him. The tracks were fresh, too fresh. "These are predator tracks," he muttered. "We need to move." Fast. Sonny's face tightened. She had seen these kinds of tracks before, but she had never been this close to danger in such a vulnerable situation. They had no time to waste. "Which way?" Sonny asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack's eyes scanned the area. The tracks led to the east, deeper into the snow-covered forest. But Jack knew that the predators often traveled in packs, and if they followed the tracks, they could be walking straight into a trap. He looked back at Sonny, his mind racing. They could go back to the cabin and wait out the storm, but that would leave them with fewer supplies. Or they could keep moving and risk everything on a chance to find food. He made his decision. "We head west," he said firmly. We'll take the long way around. It'll be harder, but safer." Sandy didn't argue. She trusted Jack's judgment, even though the decision weighed heavily on both of them. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. They were running out of time, and the storm wasn't getting any better. Jack's mind raced as they continued westward. Every sound, every movement, could be the difference between life and death. As they moved through the snow, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. They needed to find food, firewood, and shelter, and they needed to do it quickly. But as he glanced over at Sonny, he saw the same resolve in her eyes. They were in this together. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: they had no choice but to survive. The storm had shown no mercy. Hours passed as Jack and Sonny trudged through the deep snow, their movements slow and deliberate. The wind had picked up again, but they didn't dare stop. The snow piled up around them, nearly swallowing the path they had carefully carved. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, his breath coming out in visible clouds. Every few minutes he'd glance back at Sonny, making sure she was keeping up. The last thing they needed was for the storm to separate them. Sonny's face was hidden beneath the hood of her cloak, her posture strong but weary. Jack knew she was tired, but there was something about her determination that kept her going. Something in the way she moved that said she was used to hardship. The storm, the wilderness, the predators, it didn't matter to her. She was determined to keep her children safe. Every so often, Jack would look back at the cabin they had left behind. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the memory of it stayed fresh in his mind. He could still hear the fire crackling, still feel the warmth from the small room that had briefly been a refuge from the endless cold outside. But now, the cabin was just a faint shadow in the storm, a distant marker of a place they had to leave behind to survive. They had crossed the snow-covered forest and were now heading toward a ridge, where Jack hoped they would find better shelter. His instincts told him they weren't far from a small settlement. Nothing big, but enough to offer supplies, warmth, and safety. That was their goal: to get to safety, to escape the storm and whatever dangers lurked in the wilderness. As they reached the top of the ridge, Jack halted. He held up a hand to signal Sonny to stop. His sharp eyes scanned the area ahead. He could see movement in the distance. Figures, not human. The predators were back. Sonny caught sight of them too. She stopped immediately, her eyes narrowing. The creatures were large, covered in matted fur, their jaws sharp and deadly. Jack's hand went to his rifle, but he knew that firing might draw even more attention. These creatures traveled in packs, and the last thing they needed was to be surrounded. "We're too exposed here," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sonny nodded, her eyes scanning the terrain. There was a small cave to their left, hidden from view by the snow-covered rocks. It was their best chance at shelter. Without another word, they turned toward the cave, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. The creatures didn't seem to notice them yet, but Jack didn't want to take any chances. He kept his rifle close, his senses sharp. They moved through the snow, the cold biting at their skin, but the adrenaline kept them focused. The cave was just ahead, its dark entrance a welcome sight. They reached the cave without incident, slipping inside just as the wind howled behind them. Jack took a moment to catch his breath before turning to Sonny. "We'll rest here for a while. Keep an eye on the entrance." Sonny nodded and went to check the cave's interior. It was small but dry, with enough room for them to sit and catch their breath. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being exposed out in the open. Jack sat down by the entrance, keeping his rifle in his lap. He kept a careful watch on the storm, but all he could see was a thick wall of snow and wind. The creatures hadn't followed them yet, but Jack wasn't going to take any chances. Sonny moved over to where the children were huddled, trying to keep them warm. Kiana, Talon, and Juno looked up at her, their faces tired but hopeful. They were safe for now, but Jack knew they couldn't afford to stay here forever. The storm was still raging outside and their supplies were running low. "We're going to make it through this," Jack said, looking over at Sonny. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "I promise you that." Sonny didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Jack shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's nothing. Just doing what anyone would do." Sonny smiled back, but there was something in her eyes that made Jack feel like she was seeing him for the first time. Not just as a stranger, but as someone who had helped her and her children survive. He had given them hope when there was none, a way out of the storm that had threatened to swallow them whole. They sat in the cave for hours, the storm still howling outside. Jack kept watch, his mind alert, but he couldn't ignore the pull in his chest. He was tired, more tired than he had been in a long time. He had lived a life of solitude, of surviving on his own terms, but something had changed in the past few days. Something about Sonny, about her children, had made him realize that there was more to life than surviving. There was living, there was caring for others, offering protection when it was needed most. Sonny's voice broke through his thoughts. "We can't stay here forever," she said, her tone firm but thoughtful. "When the storm passes, we need to keep moving." Jack nodded, understanding. They couldn't afford to stay in the cave, not with the predators nearby and the dwindling supplies. The settlement Jack had in mind was still a long way off, but they had no choice but to keep moving. He had already made the decision. He would help them reach safety, no matter the cost. "You're right," Jack said, standing up. "We'll leave at first light. We'll head straight for the settlement." Sandy stood too, her expression resolute. "I'll keep the children ready." The night passed slowly, but as dawn finally broke, the storm showed signs of easing. The wind had died down, the snow had slowed, and there was a faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Jack knew this was their chance. He packed up their few belongings, making sure they had everything they needed for the journey. The children were ready, huddled close to Sonny, who had wrapped them in extra layers to protect them from the cold. Jack looked around the cave one last time, making sure they hadn't left anything behind. "We're ready," he said. Sonny nodded, her face determined. "Let's go." And with that, they stepped back into the snow, the storm now behind them. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and dangers, but it was a road they would walk together. For the first time, Jack wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would protect them, no matter the cost. Together they walked forward, bound not by blood but by something stronger, the will to survive, and the promise of a better life. They didn't know what the world would bring, but as they moved away from the cave, Jack felt a sense of peace. He had found something worth fighting for, and for the first time in his life he wasn't alone.